All right. So first of all, thank you for having me talk about biodiversity. As Peter just said, biodiversity is a very understudied topic, and in particular, biodiversity finance is a very new and exciting topic. And today, I will talk about some work that I've been doing with Teresa Kukler, Johannes Strobel, and Sharon Zhang on this. So the starting point is that over the last decades, there's been an increased interest in understanding the relationship between the economy and health of our planet, and what can financial markets do about this. And that's basically the field of climate finance. What's been studied much less is being biodiversity risk. And by biodiversity, what I mean is the diversity in the species and ecosystem we see in the world. And these have actually a very important role for human welfare. Biodiversity loss, which is essentially the loss in this diversity that is due mostly to human actions, can be classified in two ways, and these are the two ways in which they affect the economic system. The first one is the physical biodiversity risk, which is the risk that we incur because of the direct loss of biodiversity. For example, because we need biodiversity for food production, and we need biodiversity for the discovery of new drugs in the pharmaceutical industry. And then there's transitional biodiversity risk, which is the risk that firms incur because of the response by regulators or by consumers to help us mitigate and reduce biodiversity loss. So in this paper, we're going to ask a very specific question, which is which is generally speaking, how do financial markets perceive biodiversity risk? And it's going to be split in two parts. It's going to be a survey part in which we ask, how do people that work in finance, how do they perceive biodiversity risk? And then we're going to ask, in financial markets, do we see that this biodiversity risk is actually priced? So we're going to start with the first question. Now, is there a awareness from the point of view of market participants about this particular type of risk? And we investigate this question by running a survey among finance academics, professionals, public sector regulators, and policy economists. We get almost 700 responses, and we ask basically, how much are you worried about biodiversity risk, and on what horizon? So the answer is that indeed, most of the people that we surveyed actually are worried about biodiversity risk. These respondents think that physical and transition risks have at least a moderately material effect for firms in the US. So the vast majority does believe that it's important. And what's very interesting is that many of these participants think that the effects of biodiversity loss actually can be seen in the near future. In fact, 20% of them believe that it can be already materializing today, and another 30% believes it's going to be materialized in the next 5 to 10 years. And so people in general seem to be aware of this risk, and they think that it's important. The next big question is, okay, can we go and detect this awareness in financial markets? And so to do that, we need to basically try to understand how different firms are exposed to biodiversity risk, and we can then go to check if their prices are reflecting these exposures to biodiversity risk. So the way we're going to do it is the following. We're going to start by trying to measure an aggregate biodiversity risk index, which is important because we're going to try to understand the exposures of firms to see this biodiversity news. So we need to have a news index to conduct this analysis. The way we're going to do it is we're going to look at the New York Times text, and we're going to say every day we're going to parse the text of the New York Times using machine learning, and we're going to ask, how much is the New York Times talking about biodiversity risk today, and in what tone are the news about biodiversity bad or good? So we produce an index of biodiversity where the high numbers means bad news about diversity, and we can construct this going back to the 2000s. You can see this is the plot of the index. You can see several spikes. These spikes actually do correspond with events that we can interpret as being bad about biodiversity. For example, an announcement of changes, weakening of the Endangered Species Act. You can see a big spike over here. You can see another big spike when there was the oil spill in the Gulf Coast. At the same time, you also have some good news sometimes. For example, there's a negative spike that happens at the same time where there is a improvement of the protection of biodiversity with using a Mexican law. Okay, so you have good and bad news about diversity, and our analysis of prices will try to understand whether firms, they are differentially exposed to biodiversity risk, they go up and down in value corresponding to when these spikes in news happen. Okay, so of course to do this exercise, the fundamental question is really an accounting question, is how can we get some measure of exposures of firms to biodiversity risk? So in this paper, we take many different approaches, and we argue in the paper that it gives similar answers. The first one is to look at firms' 10K statements. So we pass through the text of the 10K statements, and we're basically trying to understand if firms are directly talking about biodiversity risk and how they're talking about that. Okay, and of course, many firms don't speak about biodiversity, but when they do, we can use that information to classify them into high risk and low risk exposures. We also directly ask, in the same survey presented before, we ask these experts in financial markets to rank industries in terms of their exposure to biodiversity risk. And finally, we look at the holdings of funds that specifically do biodiversity related investments, and we look at their portfolio holdings with the idea that those companies that they tend to overweight, they should be safer from the biodiversity risk point of view, and those that tend to underweight, those should be those that are deemed more risky. So we have 3 different rankings of firms. We aggregate them to the industry level, and so we obtain ranking of industries in terms of their exposure to biodiversity risk. So for example, we see that energy companies, and utility companies, and materials, and pharma, they are all high up in this list. Those are the most exposed firms to biodiversity risk. And on the bottom, you have firms like you have semiconductor and communication and software. Those are the least exposed to biodiversity risk. Why do these companies look like they're particularly risky? Why, for example, are energy companies risky? Well, they are risky in their case is mostly to regulation. It's because energy companies tend to work in activities that have a lot of contact with the environment and with habitats of different species. And so their economic activities might disrupt habitats. And so they are more directly exposed to the regulatory component of biodiversity risk. Other firms like food companies and pharma companies are both affected by regulatory risk, but are also directly affected by the physical risk. For example, if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, it turns out that this industry is using the biodiversity both for the production of some of the drugs, but also for the R&D, because it turns out that we can learn from the variety of information that we see in nature to learn about how to develop some drugs. And so the pharmaceutical industry is directly affected by this by biodiversity loss. So once with the ranking, we can finally ask ourselves, is this information reflected into the price? So the way we're going to ask this is the following. So what does the theory say? The theory says that if markets are pricing biodiversity risk correctly, we should expect to see that if you look at differentially companies which are high exposure versus companies that have low exposures, and now you have a day with particularly bad biodiversity news, you see the high-risk firms to drop in value, at least relative to those that are safe with respect to biodiversity risk. So in other words, an equivalent way to think about this is that if I build the hedging portfolio, which is long companies which are safe and short companies which are risky, okay, this portfolio should rise in value in days where there's bad biodiversity news, okay, because the risky companies should lose value, they're on the short side. The safe companies are on the long side. We should make money in days of bad biodiversity news. So what I'm plotting in this graph on the x-axis is actually the correlation between the returns of this portfolio and biodiversity news. If we understand correctly the exposures of different industries to biodiversity news, and if markets are pricing this correctly, then we should see a high correlation between the actual realization of the news and the valuation of the company. So the portfolio should do a high return in times with bad biodiversity news. We should see a positive correlation. Our portfolio is the one of the first row, the blue portfolio. And indeed, you can see there's a relatively high correlation between the returns of the portfolio and the return in the realization of the biodiversity news index. This is not captured by all the other accounting characteristics that we have about the firms, including their industries, their exposure to typical risky factors, and a large set of anomalies or characteristics. So other characteristics, you can see if you build portfolios, build on the other characteristics, you do significantly worse than you in correlating with the index, the biodiversity news index, than you do if you actually build the index using our risk exposures. Okay, so the conclusion is that indeed financial markets do seem to price information about biodiversity risk, and that's kind of very much in line with what the financial experts say, that they are worried about this risk, and they think that this risk is material in the short run for companies. Now, of course, what we don't know yet is whether markets are actually reacting correctly to this risk, right? That requires much more work, and we think this is an important first step in building some tools to actually measure the biodiversity risk exposures. And we think much more work can be done in this topic. And for now, we're sharing our measures on this website, biodiversityrisk.org. And we hope to see much more research in this very important field. Thank you.